Yes, indeed. I think, the last 5 years, it just seems like yesterday that I started here. It's interesting that the 5-year thing was when I was offered the job here, because I was not a young candidate, the board that appointed me said, are you prepared to commit to 5 years to the school? And I said, absolutely, and I'll sign a contract to that effect if you would like me to. And they said, no, we just want your assurance that you'll be here for 5 years. Well, that seems like yesterday. It's just been an incredibly exciting and vibrant time, and it's been just great to be here, and that time has just flown by. Well, it's interesting because my mother was, I think, is where the art came from. My mother was an incredibly capable artist herself, and had, in the 1920s, she came from a wealthy family. They were pastoral farmers in Waverley, so when she left school, it was, that delightful Edwardian, what do young ladies do until they get married? So, you played tennis, you played golf, you went on painting excursions and rode down the Whanganui River with your sketch pad and your tutor, and that was the sort of thing that my mother did. And through that she became a very, very competent watercolourist, but also a very creative thinker in that regard. So there's that side of it, and then the other side, my father being in the print media industry, of course, a lot of that had to do with design and typography, and also there's that nice background of a mixture of more fine art, but also applied design, and that sense of order and shape that typography gives to a very able designer in terms of print. So good genes. Now, something that I always wanted to do, and I don't actually know why, but I think as I have become part of the teaching profession, I think it was obvious. I now rationalise by saying it's a response to the not particularly pleasant experience that I had at school myself. I mean, we're talking about early 1960s at secondary school. There was a huge teacher shortage, so basically in Moanui, if you had a degree and could stand up in front of a group of people, you were almost press-ganged into going and supporting the schools. So when I, for example, in my fourth form year, 10 year, 3 of the local ministers were my teachers. So one of them taught mathematics, the other one taught French, and the other one taught art, but they were all men of the cloth and had parish responsibilities, but obviously because of the shortage, they were working in education to keep the schools open. And also at that same year, my maths teacher, my year 11 maths teacher was a woman who was in her 80s. But she'd gone to university as a very young woman and had a long career in teaching, but had returned to the profession because of the shortage. So it was a really interesting time, and it was also a time where those traditional values of boys' schools were there. And I still recall through the whole of my time at secondary school, I was never addressed by my Christian name, which I know was the fashion. But you feel, oh, you're just a number. And it was a big school too. When I was there was 900 kids, all boys. And you just felt that it wasn't a personal experience at all. And I think those sorts of experiences of my own, I've thought, well, actually, if this is as good as it gets, it's got to get better. So that's probably one of the reasons. And I guess also in those days, you probably recall that, or you probably know that you were actually paid to be trained as a teacher. So it was a nice progression from school to be earning money to be learning further, or earning money, being paid to attend Teachers College and University, and so it was a natural progression. Make changes, maybe not, but I think influence young people's thinking is probably more. And I don't think when you start in education, you don't think that you're going to be making changes. What you're going to do is you're going to have a significant role in the lives of young people. And in that regard, I trained as a primary teacher, and I actually quite enjoyed teaching the what are now years 7 and 8 and the intermediate years where I did most of my work there. it was really interesting time to be, because at that point of sort of transition from young childhood into almost adolescence. It's a great place to be working with young people and to see the development and the changes that can be brought about by the sorts of learning activities they engage in. But I don't think when you're starting, you're not out to say I've got a vision for what education should be like, but you do certainly have that real interest in seeing the way in which young people develop in the school context. To be fair, no. It didn't happen. It just didn't happen, and I think that is, again, I don't think it was the school's fault. I think it was the system's fault at that time. There was the whole pedagogy of the time was very much transmission education. Teacher up the front, writing stuff on the board, and you wrote it down and you learnt it, and at the end of next month you had a test. I mean, there were some interesting people that taught me. There was a young Dutch guy that I had in sixth form biology, and he was ambidextrous, so he would stand at the front at the blackboard, and he would start writing on the blackboard with his left hand with one piece of chalk, and then when he ended a word, he'd then continue on, and you couldn't tell the two bits of handwriting were absolutely the same. So, I mean, there was interesting things, but I mean, there was no relationship. That notion of relational practice in school was not part of the thinking. So it was very much transmission. You go to school, you sit down, you shut up, you write down your notes, you do your homework, and at the end you sit school certificate and university entrance. With the benefit of hindsight, yes, but at the time it was, as you say, a very interesting time in New Zealand's history, because there was still that sense when I was at school, in secondary school, of it was post-war still. My father had been to the war, he'd been in prison war for 4 years, so there was a lot of that sort of thing still permeated people's thinking. Yes, there was a satisfaction, I suppose, or a sense of comfort that we were at peace, and that there was things that were beginning to happen, but it was still very much provincial New Zealand, and I don't really feel that there was much sense of those social changes impacting on the day-to-day lives of people in the provinces. We're talking about 1960s, so I never did art at school. Because, when I went to school, on your first day as a third former, you went into the hall, you sat the Stanford Binet self-administering IQ test. It was marked overnight, and you came to school the next day, and you're in A, you're in B, you're in C, you're in D, and so on. So I made it into the A stream, and that was basically it. So we had no subject choice. There was no, I had one subject selection that I was able to make, and that was from moving from fifth form to sixth form. I had the choice by doing biology or French. That was it. So you're in the academic stream, you did science, and you did English, and you did physics, and you did chemistry, and no art. Well, it's the way you did it, and those, there was the notion of a gap year or whatever was not ever thought of. It was everyone in my class would have either gone to university or to teachers' college, and the friends that we knew who were girls were going to do nursing, or they were going to teachers' college too, or so it was just, and also again in provincial New Zealand, everyone wanted to leave town and experience other places, but certainly within the context of further training. The OE thing was when you were trained and had a bit of money behind you. Well, no, because actually to get those transfers were very difficult. You're actually if you lived within the education board, that was the one that you went to. So everyone from Waitangi went to Palmerston North, from Wellington you went to Wellington, and those sorts of things. So no, there was no temptation, and there was no opportunity. You couldn't do it then. a mixture of all of those things, because I think, you know, the teachers' colleges in those days, there was numbers of sort of philosophies that drove individual teachers' colleges, so they had their own flavour. So, I mean, it was interesting that I had friends who were attending Wellington Teachers College, and their philosophy was very much about, you know, teaching you the craft of teaching, whereas the Palmerston North approach was to say, you know, you have to have subject competence. You have to be really comfortable with your subject matter, then you will be able to become an excellent teacher, rather than saying this is how you teach mathematics. They're saying if you are really comfortable with the discipline of mathematics, then you will have a much better chance of being a good mathematics teacher. So that was actually Palmerston North was really interesting at that time, so there was a real strong academic focus, and, you know, we did a lot of sort of very much applied learning, you know, so it was very much about pushing that sort of upper secondary thinking into a much more academic approach to that subject matter. And then in the second year they would then start talking about, well, now that you know that, this is how you would best deliver it. And, you know, so it was that sort of context, and it was liberating, I suppose, after the very structured approach to secondary education at the time. Well, I mean, that was the way that the course was structured. So you had the opportunity to pick a major and a minor as your curriculum study area. So I picked visual arts as my first one, and English literature as my second, because both of those had been areas where I was passionate about art, but had never really been taught it, and I'd always been good at English. So those were the two things that I'd set out to take to the higher level, and then the rest of it was just curriculum study. So you went and did short courses in maths and science and social sciences and PE and all of those other music, but you had the opportunity to select two major studies, which, as I say, were those two. Hell no, I was born with 2 left feet, all thumbs. No, at the time there were 2 quite influential lecturers in art at Teachers College at that time. One was Frank Davis, who was one of perhaps the first European artists that started working with MAORI iconography, and so he was there as a well-known New Zealand artist at that time, and so a lot of what he was doing was actually challenging us to look at, you know, the context of New Zealand and the place of New Zealand as a Pacific Rim country, and the influences that came from Indigenous peoples in art at that time. And the other one was a guy called Ray Thorburn, and Ray Thorburn was really pushing the boundaries of sort of op art almost. So he made what he called modular works, and they were all very large format, and they were actually masked off repeatedly and taken to a car spray painter who spray painted, and he would remask them. So he built up these really interesting sort of abstract pattern type things, but they were both influential New Zealand artists at the time, and I think that made us look at much more a contemporary take on what art was about, rather than looking at the recent visual art history of New Zealand. So I don't ever remember looking at Francis Hodgkins, or certainly not Peter McIntyre, who they would have considered a painter, not an artist. I walked into a classroom for the first time as a teacher on the 1st of February 1970 at Paikokariki Primary School, teaching Form 1. Well, that's again another interesting story, the way in which teachers were put into service in those days. In those days, your first year was called a probationary assistant. So you were a PA, you had your PA year, and that was a 1-year appointment. So, and that was in the days, again, of the Wellington Education Board, and the Wellington Education Board said, you're going to go and teach there. You didn't have any real choice. So you were provided with a placement for the first year, and then following that there was your initial 2-year appointment, which was basically your first 2 years teaching. And again, that was the first 3 years of your teaching career was going to be in 2 schools, and there was no tenure. So you did 1 year, and then you did 2 years somewhere else, and then your jobs, they were fixed term positions. After that, it was Titahi Bay Intermediate, and that was an interesting thing too, because the part of the PA thing was that you were inspected regularly by a education board inspector, and so their job, we heard later, was that for that year, for 1971, they were to identify good young emerging teachers to be the first full year of Titahi Bay Intermediate's life as a school. Actually, but in the 70s it was basically, New Zealand was very much, though, Māori, Pacifica, European. The richness of other people coming in was not really apparent at that time. It was much more about, Māori and our Pacific neighbours giving the diversity to schools. There wasn't that full global village feel to those schools, which this school has sort of, but other schools we know, like Wellington East, have got much larger, diverse in terms of ethnic populations. I think our diversity here is different. That was to Hastings Girls High School as an art teacher. Again, it was an interesting move. It meant that you were actually a specialist teacher, so you weren't teaching right across the whole curriculum, but I do think that having the experience as a primary teacher that actually gives any, I think, teacher who's got a primary training moving into secondary school, does give you a much more holistic sense of what the curriculum is, and I think that helps to mitigate against the challenge of being a specialist teacher. So, because I think that you do have the ability to put what you're wanting to achieve into a context. So it's not just, I only know about this and I know the pedagogy of teaching this, but it's actually a much broader approach to learning and taking quite a holistic approach to what student learning looks like and the role of your particular strand of their learning in the context of other things that they're learning as well. So, I guess that the ability almost to integrate thinking across what you're delivering was important. So, yes, it was an interesting move, but I didn't find it particularly challenging. And again, the feedback I got about my performance was, said that I was actually doing okay. No. At that stage, I was married and we had a young family, so that was, a nice place to be. Hawke's Bay was great, and you'll know from my history that we've been up and down from Hawke's Bay on a number of occasions. So no, it was just a great opportunity to have time there in Hawke's Bay, where my wife's family was, and to sort of engage with another kind of life, and it was really interesting. And both my kids, if you ask them, would both say that they see Hawke's Bay as their home, because we were there for a while. I think right through the 80s was the start of what was laying the foundation of what is now the New Zealand curriculum. So a lot of the work was going into actually looking at the core competency sort of concept was beginning to come through in the thinking. There was basically every subject was reviewed, and there was new curriculum statements made for it. And at the same time, I think people were beginning to really question the notion of the current qualification structure. So I think it was a really exciting time to be there, and also in terms of education, that was at the beginning of the starting thinking about where tomorrow's schools might take us, and so it was really quite a significant shift from sort of the education board power and actually beginning to give schools the opportunity to engage in their own conversations about what learning looked like at the school and how the curriculum was going to be organised and how timetable was going to be organised. So there was a time of sort of quite liberal thinking, and I think that was probably serendipitous in terms of what happened in the next 10 years when Tomorrow's Schools was implemented. And I think there was probably, I don't know whether it was ever written as a strategic intent to start moving some of that thinking into schools, but certainly you got the feeling that everything was up for grabs. You could start thinking about doing things differently, that that schools were becoming more autonomous. Those things about relationships with families and all those sorts of things started to change the nature of what schools felt like. I think it's the adaptability is the most important thing. I think if you're going to maintain currency in your practice, and if you're going to maintain currency in terms of the changing landscape of education, I do think you have to be quite adaptable. Whether you have to think laterally, we're still bound by, although the New Zealand curriculum currently is very open-ended and very empowering, you're still actually working within a quite detailed framework. So as I've said often, that in New Zealand schools are 90% the same, and it's 10% on top that makes them different. So that 90% is still pretty much what the New Zealand curriculum is, what the current thinking in terms of education is, all of those sorts of things are quite static, and there's not a lot of space for liberality, unless you do things like Wellington High School has done, particularly under Prue Kelly, where he said, okay, sleep research says that young people learn better after a good night's sleep, so we'll give them another hour in bed, and that's the flexibility that Tomorrow's Schools has given us. And that was very brave, as you know. In nature, absolutely, kids are kids. They're inquiring, they're energetic, they're frustrating. All of those things are absolute constants. I do think that in the emerging technologies, as you've mentioned, I think that the role of social media has really impacted on schools. I think that the whole thing of the immediacy of any information now in a global sense is, you can watch in real time a war on the other side of the world. That has to affect your view of the world and the access, your right to access information. And I think that's probably the thing that schools are still challenged by, making appropriate use of the immediacy of that information and social media and the whole thing of information technology. I think it's obviously effective, incredibly effective when used well, but we also know that bring your own device can be great when the device is used, but as we were talking about the other day with the senior team here, it can also mean bring your own distraction, and I think we're still finding our way through that, and I think we'll continue to find our way through that for a long time to come. I'm not saying fine-tuning. I'm thinking that when any technology changes, I've heard a guy talking, a future theorist talking, and he said, that for the last 400 years we've basically been working on the technology of the book, the written word on paper. That took 400 years to change. So we've got a 400-year wait to actually see what the technology of technology is going to do. What is that immediacy of information going to do for the future? What is that social contact thing? Who doesn't have a cell phone? That's changed the very fundamental nature of communication. Well, my basic philosophy is humanist. So, if you're thinking about that, you asked before about the changes in young people in schools. Has the actual character of being a human person in the 21st century, is it any different to being a person in the 20th century? And I don't think that it has made, the impact of social change still means people are people. There are good people, there are people who are challenged by things, there are people who are, innovators, there are people who are tradesmen, and there are people who are craftsmen, and those sort of essential roles within communities have remained the same. But again, I also think that for the whole of mankind, that the technology, or the impact of technology, is going to be something that is much longer than a generation. Well, I guess the answer to that is in the time I was at Mana College. So if you're in a place and you actually stay there for a number of years, and I was at Mana College for 18 years, and you are interested and competent, you end up collecting roles. So, I was there as the head of art, and then the school moved from departments into faculty, so there was an opportunity there to say, well, what happens here? How does this work? So there was a technical arts faculty, which I became the head of, and at the same time I then became the senior school dean. And so over a period of time you collect a whole lot of responsibilities, so you become part of the core of the school's thinking. And then you're asked to carry out projects within the school. So we're doing this, we're going to review the senior school curriculum, could you front a group of people to look at that? And so over time you end up just, as I say, collecting a whole lot of experiences and using your influence with staff to bring about change and to try new things. So, I guess over that 18 years, virtually every role you can say in the school, I've done through that sort of learning management, behaviour management, pastoral care, all of those things. I've had those experiences, and then ultimately I was appointed as DP internally. So there were 2 DPs. I was one of them, and after 5 years of being the deputy principal, I thought, well, this is really interesting. I'm really enjoying this. I'd like to run my own school. I'd like to see what it's like to be, in the hot seat. So I was fortunate enough to get appointed to FLEXMERE College. Oh yes, I can remember the interview.
Tough interview?
No, it was a very interesting interview because the school had not had a particularly good couple of years, and they had just had a very, very damning error report, and so the interview was pretty much about, these are our challenges, what suggestions would you have to bring about change, or to bring this back on track. So that was very much the tone and the target of the interview. And although I wasn't offered the job on site, I walked out of that interview knowing I had the job. And by the end of that day, I did have the job. Well, it's much smaller now than it was when I was there. Yeah, when I took it over, there were 360 kids there, which was a really good introduction to principalship, because it was at a size where you virtually knew every kid, except the last 2 enrolments that you didn't know. You knew every kid. Walking through the playground, you could stop and talk to individual kids and talk to them and have a conversation about them and where they were at, and using their name. And it was also a very interesting school in that it was 85% Māori and about 9% Cook Island Māori and one or two others. So it was very much a school of its community, and it was a really interesting experience. And as you will know, FLEXMERE is probably one of the most challenging communities in New Zealand, or challenged communities, so it was really interesting to be part of that. And certainly the school there, in the true sense of the word, was a community hub, and a lot of the work that we did there was as a response to community need. Absolutely fine. There's never been I've never had an issue with relationships, because there's that fundamental belief of mine that you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So if you're respectful and kind and nice and polite to people, then you can expect to be treated like that. And that's been it's been a sort of a guiding principle, and it has really got me into trouble. To be fair, when I walked in there, the NCA achievement at level 1 was 5%. 5%. So the year before I got there, one student in year 11 got NCA 1. 2 years later, we were hovering on 70% of the students, in an environment which had a 60% transience in terms of kids coming in and out each year. So you start the year with 350 kids, and at the end of the year, there'd be 200 new kids in the school because 200 had left. Because it was in that sort of triangle of itinerant workers who would move based on where the work was. So that was a huge achievement, I believe. So kids actually got to be effectively learning. We looked at a whole range of other things in terms of really focusing on, in the senior school, the credit culture, so kids knew what they were able to achieve, and every conversation we had with any was, what last credit did you get? What's your next assessment? What do you expect to get for that? And with that sort of that shift in culture across the school had amazing impact. Yes, but no. I think that sometimes in change management, you get to a point where the instigator of the change and the process you go through gets to a point where actually it needs a new voice. And I think after 5 years of intensive work, it needed a new voice. It's unfortunate in some regards that new voice was going to be Te Kotahitanga. So as I was leaving the school signed up to be Te Kotahitanga school. So that would have been the new voice if I had stayed. So, but it was also an opportunity for me to experience another sort of school. So when I applied for the Wellington High School job, that was a step in another direction, because, as you've said, FLEXMERE was one of the smallest secondary schools in New Zealand. And at the time, Wellington High School was in the top 20 in New Zealand for size, and was certainly the second biggest provincial school in New Zealand. There was 1,850 kids. So you go from a school of staff of 30 and 350 kids to a staff of 105 and 1,850 kids. So that was a very interesting step. Yes, but I think that's slightly unfair on Wellington High School. I mean, there were things that I had to put in place, plans that were in place that would have changed what I was, would have changed that environment rapidly had I stayed. However, I had always said that, Ali, my wife, and I had always said that if we could get back to Wellington, that would be our goal. So we went to Hawke's Bay saying, well, one day we'll get back to Wellington, we had a house here, went to Wellington, same thing. So, and then Wellington High School came up, and I thought, well, this is the job, that if I was to be asked about any school that I wanted to be in Wellington, where would I want to come to? It was here. So it was, was out and dust down the CV and write some new stuff and flick in an application. No, because what you've just said was no surprise. So, you know, if you were walking in here to be principal after Prue Kelly, you knew what her legacy was, you knew her way of thinking, you knew about the things that she had done in the school that were innovative. So you know that you're stepping into a very established model of leadership in a school that has got an established culture, in a school that has been forward-thinking and has put some things into place that are radical. So you know what you're walking into, and I guess, you know, forewarned is forearmed. So you're walking. It's not going to be an easy. I don't think walking into any school as a leader, as the principal, is easy. Because there are so many factors at play about learning the school culture, about having to make an early visible change to say that the leadership has changed without breaking anything, to get to know people, to get to, you know, read the staff culture, read the community culture, read the student culture, and, you know, through that amalgam find a way to say, you know, this is something that we can do that is going to, you know, improve things, but at the same time influence some sort of change without breaking anything. And that's where you've got to be smart. The thing is, one thing that the school has always been very good at is documenting the thinking that is behind the school. So, you know, you have access to the charter and the annual plan and all of those things, and you can really start thinking about, you know, what are the drivers here? You know, what are the things that set this place apart? And, you know, I've always been of the opinion that what the community perception of a school is based on a number of perspectives, and the perspectives are, you know, does our family values align with that school's values, or do our family values align with that school's values? So, you know, that sort of thing about the RATBAGS going to a school, to me, that doesn't wash with me. Basically, you know, you look at the documentation, you say, what are the key drivers? Now, you know, if I had a 14-year-old son at the moment who was passionately keen to play cricket in the summer and play rugby in the winter, you know, to be fair, I wouldn't be sending him to Wellington High School, although I know he would have a brilliant time here. But if his passion is sport, we know that this is not a sports school. If, on the other hand, I had a daughter who wanted to do art and photography and learn to dance and play the bass guitar, I would make a different set of choices, and, you know, then that would be this would be a school of choice. If you look back at all of those things, you know, it's about, my view is that it's about the family alignment of values to the schools. So I don't actually, you know, I'm not swayed by public perceptions, because I've worked in schools where public perceptions have been nowhere near the reality of what's happening in the school, and clearly, as you can know from my history. So, no, so, you know, I prepared really well. There was a question that they would put to candidates, which was about what was your vision for the future of the school. So I did a lot of reading around how I could put together a compelling presentation that would align my thinking with where the school was at, and the rest, as they say, is history. Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One is that the school itself, although it's 130 years old, has been through a whole lot of iterations. I think that one of the other things is that there has been, certainly in the 60s and 70s, a stigma about technical colleges in terms of, you know, comparing them to academic colleges, and I think that that contributes to a more a more liberal outlook, maybe. People were more pragmatic. Kids who came to technical schools were probably more pragmatic and looking for a qualification so they could go and do things rather than building a history and a legacy. It's a hard one, because I think that in some ways those schools that have got those strong and long traditions, I think they live off the traditions rather than of the reality of the day at times. And I think we are more honest by not having this is what we do, and we go and beat up other boys' schools at an athletics day. I think we're much better to go and have fun ourselves at a carnival. Myself. I think we produce people who are ready to take the next step in their life. And I don't think you would want to say that we're producing technicians or whatever. I think we're producing people who have got the social, personal and academic skills to say, having been at this school for 5 years, my next logical step is to do this, and the school has prepared me well for that. And I think that whether it's to go to university and ultimately get a PhD, or whether it is to go to art school, or whether it's to go to Toi Whakaari, or whether it's to go wherever, I think students who leave here are really well prepared to take those steps, and have also had the experiences of self-management and social interaction that make them successful when they make those choices. Now, to be absolutely fair, the reason for that was that the person who had for years been the editor of the magazine was going through some difficult times and was unable to produce the magazine, and we just were unable to produce it. It wasn't a conscious choice; it was a default choice. It was just one of those unfortunate things that happened. Yes, we were certainly looking at taking a digital presence, but it wasn't a strategic move. It was a pragmatic requirement. It's regrettable that there isn't a 2012 magazine, but I don't think it's that damaging. I think what has happened, well, as you know, Michael Harcourt did most of the early work with that, and I think what it has done is to put the Māori, Te Ao Māori, in the forefront of the school's thinking, and I think that's the most important thing that we have done. So although that was a politically important move to sign off that accord, I think the impact of that is much more far-reaching than that, from the fact that we have now taken that support and created Te Whānau Taraika. We've got artwork happening in Taraika. We've got a Māori name for the school. We've got a whole range of activities that were not happening in Whakanuia, that were not happening before, that are happening now. So I think it was like the tipping point. So once that had been done, and we knew that we had got basically the support of the tangata whenua to look at doing things in a different way, I think the school has then taken that opportunity and taken that mandate and done some really great things. And I think that's the legacy of that accord. Well, yes, the gender neutral pathway, I don't know whether even they've happened at Onslow yet, because it said that they were in the planning. Well, I mean, how hard does it need? I mean, we got an approach from Ultraviolet, the GBLIQ team, and they said, we want to do that. It happened to be just before a board meeting. I said to the board, we need to do this. They said yes. Within 2 weeks it was done. I mean, it wasn't, Wellington High School has, over the years, has done a number of things that just happened because we want to do them, and not in my time, but the BYOD thing was really interesting at the time, that Orewa College on the North Shore in Auckland was making front page newspaper headings throughout the country about expecting Year 9s to bring a device to school. It had been happening here for 2 years, just unsung. You just get on and do it. And I think that's one of the things about the school that is so exciting, is that when a well-considered idea comes up, rather than navel gaze about it, we say, well, we'll give it a go. We'll try it. We'll take a risk and see if it works, and we'll review it. And I think that's that sort of willingness to challenge existing thinking and challenge existing processes is really what makes this place so unique. I haven't sought information from previous principals, to be fair, of this school. I have a network of other principals that are my friends, but I think that, interestingly, in those situations that you're speaking of, when things do get a little bit challenging, it's actually mostly about context. And as a school leader, I'm part of a leadership team, and the other members of the team are much more able to provide possible solutions to a challenge rather than someone from the outside. So when those challenges do come along, we think, oh, what are we going to do here? I'm not going to pick up the phone and ring someone who's in another school. I'm going to walk down the corridor and say to the DPs, can we meet for 10 minutes? Because that's the context. Those are the people down there who know the school. They're the ones who know the staff involved. They're the ones who know the kids involved. They've got between them, another 100 years of experience to add to my 40 years. So you don't need to look outside your school for that sort of support. Well, I think the legacy is that I think we've established a new level for what the school role looks like, and I think that probably, that is now, rather than a school of 1,000, it is going to maintain its role as a school of around 1,200, which changes a whole lot of things in terms of the number of staff you can employ, the amount of money you can have to spend, and those sort of things. So I think that's one legacy. I think the other legacy would be, the Wero value statement that we worked on when we were doing that work 4 years ago. I think that is an enduring piece of thinking that may be revised and may be polished over time, but I do think that those 4 values are the fundamental values of an effective society anywhere. So I think that they're probably going to be there for a long time, and they should be. And I think the other thing is that I think that in terms of us being a bicultural nation, I think that we have done some amazing work over the last 4 to 5 years to make sure that things Māori are front and centre of the thinking of the school. And I think that if you're looking for a physical manifestation of that change, I think the work that people have loved to do to decorate the ceiling of Tarahika is an enduring legacy. That's a hard one, because you have to be really sensitive as a former principal about your presence in the school when someone new's there. But certainly I will look upon my 5 years here as a fitting end to 47 years in education, and I will always have that warm affection for the place. And I still think that, as I said to an assembly yesterday, about people who visit here can't believe that education can be like this, and I think that's something that I will hold and say, actually, I have experienced a model of education that is truly student-centred, and it really works.